All right, Mohammed, I've heard that theory elsewhere as well. The former British ambassador to Syria, Peter Ford, said that that could be a false flag operation to get countries like the United States to get involved.
I've heard a couple of voices here and there, notably the Assad regime. Right. There's no disputing the fact that the Assad regime was responsible for this massacre, just like the Assad regime was responsible for the very heinous massacre. Also, execution by gassing with chemical gases in 2013. There's a pattern in the Assad regime, even aside from nerve agents and sarin gas. Assad regime has consistently used chlorine against Syrian civilians, and the United Nations independent Commission of Inquiry or mechanism for investigating these things concluded that the Assad regime, following thorough investigations, that the Assad regime was responsible. But of course, that's something the regime would say to try and deflect criticism. There is, just to the points that some of my colleagues brought up, there is, Bashar al-Assad is not going to be Trump's Sisi. Bashar al-Assad has killed over 500,000 people, displaced half the country's population. As you know, Mr. Trump is no fan of an increased number of Syrian refugees into the United States, or just refugees in general.
Right.
So that is why there is a real shift in attitudes in Washington, D.C. that we've seen in no uncertain terms this week. Nikki Haley said regime change in Syria is, quote, inevitable. McMaster said peace is unfathomable. It's, it's just not conceivable.
That is a change in policy, though. That's not initially.
With Assad. Yeah. Yes. In D.C. this week has indicated and signaled in no uncertain terms that there cannot be peace in Syria with Assad. And I think the Trump administration is interested in reducing refugee flows and stabilizing the region.
All right, I want to get to that point in a moment. Let me go to Joshua Landis. Joshua, when you look at this strike that took place against this airbase in Syria, did the U.S. violate international law? I mean, what authority did the U.S. use to conduct this strike?
It's upholding international norm. That's what it would claim, that it is policing this international norm for human rights. And that's its authority. The United States has conducted air raids in, I think it's 6 or 7 countries in the last month. And so America's authority has gotten broader over time.
Alexander, what do you think? Was this a violation of international law?
Well, I think it's a violation of international law. I think that, and Russia, by the way, has stated it categorically. I think also that we are witnessing a certain distraction in Syria from other failures of the U.S. and its allies. Don't forget that in Iraq, there's a disaster happening in Mosul, and civilians are dying there, and children as well. And that sort of doesn't worry anybody in Washington. Not to mention, of course, Yemen, where there is a genocide going on with direct involvement of Western powers who supply the Saudis with munitions. So in effect, I would say that this particular instance in Syria, this particular crisis, current crisis, I think is a distraction from the failures across the board, by the way. Look everywhere. Look at North Korea. Look at Ukraine. Look at Libya. And to be honest with you, I find it quite ridiculous that we are hearing from Western powers saying that Assad must go, Assad is a criminal. Excuse me, Assad is the only force, his government and his army is the only force in Syria that is fighting ISIS, that is fighting al-Nusra and al-Qaeda. Nobody else is doing that. And yet, we hear all these voices, he must go, and nobody is suggesting who will replace him. And I agree with that point, that ISIS and al-Qaeda will replace him if he goes. So I just can't understand the logic behind these statements.
Okay, Mohammed, I know you want to respond to that very quickly.
It is not just, it's definitely upholding international norms, but not only upholding international norms, it's also upholding international law. Syria-related United Nations Security Council resolutions, there's a number of them, and they're online, anyone can look them up, specifically say that the Assad regime should, the Syrian government, that's how it's phrased, the Syrian government should cease and desist use of chemical weapons against civilian populations in Syria. And if that does, in case the Syrian regime fails to do so, then countries, United Nations Security Council members, have the authority to actually hold the Syrian regime to account under Chapter 7. So there is definitely legal basis. It's not just international norms, but it's also international law. And I would also like to say that Syrian rebels, yes, backed by the United States, backed by Britain, backed by France, recently liberated about 162 square kilometers from ISIS. The Assad regime, we know the Assad regime left ISIS unscathed in Raqqa for years. So this, I think we need to dispense with this myth that the Assad regime is a force against ISIS. The Assad regime finances ISIS through lucrative oil deals. It's a force for collaboration with ISIS,
let me just get the view of Alexander very quickly. Alexander, you dispute the fact that this characterization that the US did have authority to carry out this attack.
No, they didn't, simply because there was no evidence that Assad's regime used these weapons. You can't, come back to the same situation as with Iraq. No weapons of mass destructions, but we say there are weapons of mass destruction. The same, by the way, method was used in Libya. There was this made-up situation that allegedly was a massacre was going to take place in Benghazi, and they destroyed the country. The same thing is done in Yemen, exactly the same thing. And they're trying to use the same scenario here. They're trying to put pressure on Russia now through G7. This won't work.
Okay, Omar in London, when we look at whatever resolution there comes about to resolve this crisis, is the bottom line that Bashar al-Assad remains in power?
Well, it depends what the Syrian people would want, really, and I can assure you that a large number of I would say the majority of the Syrian people regard this current government as their guarantor for safety, their protector. Now, you're going to give them some sort of assurances to let him go? Good luck. I don't think anyone can. So at least for the foreseeable future, for those Syrians who have upheld the government, who have sent their children to the army in order to protect themselves, this is the best they have. And, there isn't anything on the horizon, so, sorry to speak, that is anywhere near guaranteeing a stable government in Damascus. But I would like to go back to something very short. The Syrian army hasn't been fighting ISIS alone, It's also fighting another branch of Al-Qaeda. It's called Jabhat al-Nusra, and it's everywhere. And this fight has been going on, on every single day, on every single imaginable front line. So, to say that Syrian army hasn't really dealt with ISIS, it has been fighting ISIS since the very beginning, probably at a defensive position because it didn't have the resources, but also equally Jabhat al-Nusra, which makes up more than half of the fighting force against from the moderate opposition against the Syrian army. It's on a daily basis.
Okay, Joshua Landis, let's look at some of the diplomatic scenarios that are unfolding right now. So we have Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State of the United States, goes to Moscow, has talks with Moscow. They're going to talk about the Syrian situation. The question that's going to be posed to Rex Tillerson is, okay, we understand your concerns about Bashar al-Assad being in power, but if he is overthrown, whom do you replace him with?
Yes, indeed. And I don't think there's an answer for that on America's part. Russia and the United States have a lot of common interests in Syria. They are also rivals, there's no doubt about it. But I think that their common interests in Syria are going to overtake the rivalry. They have to concentrate on ISIS and taking Raqqa, and that means getting a broad agreement on what to do with the Euphrates Valley once the United States uses the Syrian Democratic Forces, as they're called, the largely Kurds with an Arab expeditionary force attached, to take Raqqa and then move down the Euphrates Valley towards Deir ez-Zor. Because the Syrians are in Deir ez-Zor, there's going to be some kind of division of this region amongst the Syrian government, which is very interested in taking it back, and the Kurds. Now, there's also a question of various Arab forces that could take it. Will America act as a mandate? Will it divide the place into 3 or into 2? We don't know what Trump's policy is. I would imagine that in Russia, he has to begin to hammer out what is a future policy that's going to be acceptable to the Russians, to Assad, to the Kurds, and to the Turks. That's a very complex picture. He needs the cooperation of the Russians if he's going to get it done, if he wants an exit strategy. And I believe that Trump and Tillerson both want to get out of Syria when the job is done. They do not want to keep special forces there to protect eastern Syria.